In 1955, you could buy a brand new family sedan for around $1,500. A nice house in a good American suburb might run you $10,000 to $12,000. And in a quiet garage outside Stuttgart, engineers at Mercedes-Benz were putting the finishing touches on a car that, today, would sell for more than a Boeing 737. That's not a typo. Keep that number in your head, because we're going to spend the next 25 minutes building up to it. This is the story of the most expensive European cars to come out of the 1950s, the decade that arguably built the entire idea of the supercar before that word even existed. These weren't just fast cars. They were rolling engineering flexes, built by companies that had just watched their factories get bombed flat during the war and decided, almost out of spite, to build the most beautiful, most dangerous, most extraordinary machines the world had ever seen. We're going to count down from the merely eye-watering to the almost incomprehensible, and along the way, I'll show you exactly what each of these cars is worth if one changed hands today. Grab a coffee. Some of these numbers are going to make you put it down. Before we get into the list, it's worth asking, why is this specific decade, the 1950s, such a goldmine for the most valuable cars on Earth? 3 reasons. First, recovery. Europe in 1950 was still digging itself out of rubble. Factories that had built tanks and fighter planes 5 years earlier were now being repurposed to build cars, and the engineers who designed them were the same people who'd just spent a war pushing metal and horsepower to their absolute limits. That knowledge didn't evaporate. It went straight into road cars and race cars. Second, racing was marketing. There was no internet, no viral social clip, no influencer unboxing. If Ferrari or Mercedes or Jaguar wanted to sell cars, they won races, Le Mans, the Mille Miglia, the Carrera Panamericana, and then they sold a road-going version of the winning car to rich customers. That means almost every desirable 1950s European car has an actual competition history baked into its chassis number. It's not just old. It won things. Third, scarcity by design. These weren't mass-produced. Companies like Ferrari, Aston Martin, and Talbot Lego built these cars in the dozens, sometimes in single digits. Combine, built in tiny numbers, hand-assembled by legendary engineers, and actually raced at Le Mans, and you get exactly the kind of object that, 70 years later, wealthy collectors will fight each other to own. So with that context locked in, let's start the countdown. Talbot Lego T26 Grand Sport, 1948 to 1954, we're bending the rules slightly to start with the Talbot Lego, because while the company's glory days technically began in the late 1940s, the T26 Grand Sport carried straight through the early 50s and represents something the rest of this list doesn't: pure, unapologetic French elegance. Talbot Lego was a small, almost boutique operation, Italian-born engineer Antonio Lego running a French chassis company, dropping in a race-bred 4.5-liter straight-six, and then handing the bodywork over to coach builders like Sauchik and Fagoni E.T. Falaschi, who treated every car like a sculpture rather than a product. Fewer than 20 of the Grand Sport coupes were built with the most desirable coachwork. Back in period, this was a car for European aristocracy, the kind of thing you'd see parked outside a casino in Monte Carlo. Today's value, roughly $2 million to $4 million, with the most spectacular coach-built examples pushing past that when they hit the right auction on the right day. It's the entry point on this list, and that alone should tell you something about where we're headed. Alfa Romeo 6C 3000 cm, 1953. Alfa Romeo doesn't get talked about enough in this conversation, and that's a crime, because in the early 1950s, Alfa was arguably still the benchmark that Ferrari and Maserati were trying to beat. The 6C 3000 cm, cm stood for Corsa Modificata, or modified for racing, was Alfa's factory-backed weapon for endurance racing, built in genuinely tiny numbers, around a dozen or so depending on how you count prototypes and variants. It ran at Le Mans and the Mille Miglia with bodies that looked like they were poured rather than built, all curves and haunches over the wheel arches. Because so few survive, and because Alfa's Mille Miglia pedigree is basically unmatched, values have crept up steadily over the last 15 years, particularly as collectors realized Ferraris were becoming almost unaffordably expensive and started shopping the tier just below. Today's value, in the region of $4 million to $6 million for a genuine, well-documented example with real competition history. Aston Martin DB3S, 1953 to 1956. Now we start climbing into genuinely serious money. The DB3S was Aston Martin's factory racing effort of the mid-1950s, developed under legendary engineer Willie Watson and driven by names like Stirling Moss and Peter Collins. It never quite managed the outright Le Mans win everyone wanted. It came agonizingly close, second overall in 1955 and 1956, but it built a reputation as one of the most beautiful and best-handling sports racers of its era. Only around 30 were built across works and customer specifications, and today they're treated as blue-chip British collector cars, second in status only to Jaguar's D-Type, which we'll get to shortly. A DB3S sold through RM Sotheby's a few years back for north of $20 million, and that wasn't even one of the most historically significant chassis in the run. The genuinely important works cars, the ones with real podium finishes attached to their chassis number, sit meaningfully above that. Today's value, roughly $20 million to $28 million, depending on race history and originality. Porsche 550 Spider, 1953 to 1956. I know what some of you are thinking. Porsche in the 50s? This tiny thing. Yes, this tiny thing. The 550 Spider is one of the most important cars Porsche ever built. Not because it was fast in absolute terms. Its little four-cam flat 4 made less than 150 horsepower, but because it was light, aerodynamically brilliant, and shockingly effective against much bigger, more powerful machinery in class racing throughout Europe and America. It's also, unfortunately, one of the most famous cars in Hollywood history for the darkest possible reason. James Dean was driving one, nicknamed Little Bastard, when he was killed in 1955. That grim footnote has, whether we like it or not, only added to the car's mythology and market demand. Only around 90 examples were built, and pristine, matching numbers cars with clean histories now regularly clear 8 figures. Today's value, roughly $10 million to $15 million, with exceptional, well-documented cars occasionally exceeding that. Bentley R-Type Continental, 1952 to 1955. Let's take a breather from pure racing machines for a second, because not everything on this list is a stripped-out competition car. The Bentley R-Type Continental was, when it launched in 1952, the fastest 4-seat production car in the world, genuinely capable of around 120 miles an hour while carrying 4 adults in leather-lined, wood-trimmed comfort. Coach-built almost entirely by H.J. Mulliner, with a small number bodied by other British and European coach builders, the R-Type Continental was aimed squarely at people who wanted to drive from London to the French Riviera in a single day without breaking a sweat. It was, essentially, the original Grand Tourer, the car that basically invented the modern GT car category that Aston Martin, Bentley, and Ferrari still sell today. Around 200 were built, which sounds like a lot compared to everything else on this list, but pristine original examples are exceptionally rare, and the car's continued relevance, Bentley still uses the Continental name today, keeps demand strong. Today's value, roughly $700,000 to $1.5 million for the best examples, with a handful of exceptional coach-built variants exceeding $2 million. That might look like small change compared to what's coming, but remember, this was a genuinely usable, comfortable road car, not a stripped race machine. For what it is, that's an enormous number. Lancia D50/Lancia Ferrari, 1954 to 1955. This one's a bit different from everything else on the list, because the Lancia D50 wasn't a road car or a sports racer, it was an out-and-out Formula One machine, and it's here because of just how radical and important it was. Designed by Vittorio Jano, the same engineer behind Alfa Romeo's greatest pre-war cars, the D50 was startlingly advanced for 1954. A V8 engine mounted as a stressed chassis member, fuel tanks positioned in pontoons between the wheels rather than at the back, for better weight distribution. Juan Manuel Fangio drove one to the World Championship in 1956. After Lancia handed the entire program over to Ferrari when the Italian car company ran into financial trouble. Because of that handover, most surviving D50s are technically Lancia Ferraris, and because so few genuine period Grand Prix cars from this era survive with verified chassis and engine numbers, values have become almost impossible to predict. These cars essentially never come to public auction, because owners know exactly what they have. Estimated value if one were sold today, $25 million to $35 million plus, based on comparable sales of period Formula One machinery with World Championship winning provenance. This is genuinely a name-your-price category of car. Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, 1954 to 1957. Now we're into the cars almost everyone recognizes, even if they don't know the name. The 300 SL, universally nicknamed the Gullwing for those iconic upward-swinging doors, is arguably the single most famous European sports car of the entire decade. It was the first production car with a fuel-injected engine. It was genuinely capable of around 160 miles an hour depending on gearing, which made it the fastest production car in the world at the time it launched in 1954, and it looked like nothing else on the road. The doors, by the way, weren't a styling gimmick. The 300 SL's race-derived tubular space frame chassis had such tall door sills that conventional doors were structurally impossible, so Mercedes engineers simply hinged them from the roof instead. Function became the car's most iconic feature. Around 1,400 coupes were built, along with a slightly rarer, less structurally extreme roadster version that followed. Because production numbers were relatively high for this list, Gullwings are actually one of the more attainable cars here, which is a strange thing to say about a car that now regularly changes hands for seven figures. Today's value, roughly $1.2 million to $2 million for a solid coupe, climbing well past $2.5 million for rare alloy-bodied competition versions, of which fewer than 30 were built with lightweight aluminum bodywork instead of steel. Jaguar D-Type, 1954 to 1957. This is where things stop being merely expensive and start becoming absurd. The Jaguar D-Type is, without much argument, the greatest British racing car of the 1950s. Designed by aerodynamicist Malcolm Sayer, who came to car design from the aircraft industry, the D-Type looked like nothing else racing at the time. A shape born in a wind tunnel rather than a styling studio, complete with a distinctive fin behind the driver's head for high-speed stability. It worked. The D-Type won Le Mans 3 years running, in 1955, 1956, and 1957, the last of those with private Scottish team Écurie Écosse rather than the factory. Jaguar built only around 75 examples across all specifications. In 2016, a D-Type, specifically chassis XKD 501, the actual car that won Le Mans outright in 1956 for Écurie Écosse, and one of the only surviving Le Mans winning examples still in largely unrestored, original condition, sold at RM Sotheby's Monterey auction for $21.78 million. At the time the most expensive British car ever sold at public auction. Bidding opened around $10 million and simply kept climbing. That sale reset the entire market for the model. Lesser D-Types, cars without an outright Le Mans win attached to their history, now regularly sell in the $6 to $15 million range depending on chassis history, while any example that can genuinely claim a Le Mans victory sits in a different universe entirely. Today's value, roughly $10 million for a solid, non-winning example, up to $21 million plus for a genuine Le Mans winning chassis. Ferrari 250 Testarossa, 1957 to 1961, we're now firmly in the territory of cars that no ordinary human being will ever own, drive, or even see up close outside of a museum ropeline. The Ferrari 250 Testarossa simply means red head, a nickname earned from the bright red paint Ferrari used on the cam covers of its V12 engine, was the company's dominant sports racing weapon of the late 1950s and early 1960s. It's instantly recognizable thanks to its swooping, pontoon front fenders, designed to help cooling airflow, and it won Le Mans outright in 1958, 1960, and 1961. Only around 34 were ever built. Here's where the story gets genuinely wild. In 2009, a 250 Testarossa sold at an RM auction in Maranello, Italy, for just over $12 million, at the time a new world record for any car sold at public auction. 2 years later, in 2011, a different Testarossa, chassis 0666TR, the very first prototype ever built, the literal rolling testbed for the entire Testarossa program, sold at Gooding & Company's Pebble Beach auction for $16.39 million, breaking the record again. It debuted at the Nürburgring 1,000 kilometers in 1957 and had survived not one but 2 fires across its racing life. And it doesn't even stop there. In 2014, a Testarossa reportedly changed hands privately for a sum rumored to be somewhere around $39 to $40 million, though because it was a private sale rather than a public auction, exact figures were never officially confirmed. That's the nature of the very top of this market. The biggest numbers often happen quietly, between dealers and collectors, away from any auction paddle at all. Today's value, roughly $15 million to $20 million for a documented race history example at public auction, with the rarest prototype and works cars capable of reaching well beyond that in private transactions. Mercedes-Benz 300 SLR, Uhlenhaut COUP, 1955, and here we are. The car that made me open this whole video with a Boeing 737 comparison, and I wasn't exaggerating. The 300 SLR Uhlenhaut Coupe is, on paper, a strange thing to call the most valuable car in the world, because it barely raced at all. It's essentially a road-legal hardtop version of the Mercedes-Benz W196, the same Formula One chassis that carried Juan Manuel Fangio to back-to-back world championships in 1954 and 1955, adapted into an open sports racer called the 300 SLR for endurance events, and then, finally, wrapped in a closed gullwing body as a kind of engineering flagship. Only two were ever built. Mercedes never sold either one. For decades they sat inside the company's own private collection, occasionally driven by Rudolf Uhlenhaut himself, the brilliant engineer who developed the car and who reportedly used one as an actual company car, commuting to work in what may well be, pound for pound, the single most valuable object with wheels ever created. The 300 SLR line carries a genuinely dark chapter of motorsport history too. An open-top 300 SLR, driven by French driver Pierre Leva, was involved in the catastrophic 1955 Sierra Leonean Leone's Mans disaster, still the deadliest crash in motorsport history, when the car was launched into the crowd after a collision on the main straight. Mercedes withdrew from racing entirely for years afterward. It's a heavy, tragic footnote that hangs over the model's legacy, even though the Uhlenhaut Coupe itself was never involved in that accident. For 67 years, neither of the two Uhlenhaut Coupes left Mercedes ownership. Then, in May 2022, in a private, invitation-only sale organized with R.M. Sotheby's at the Mercedes-Benz Museum in Stuttgart, one of the two cars was sold to a private collector. The price, €135 million, roughly $143 million US dollars. It didn't just break the previous record for a car sold at auction. It obliterated it. The prior record holder, a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO sold in 2018, had gone for $48.4 million, meaning the Uhlenhaut Coupe sold for nearly 3 times that figure in a single sale. It remains, as of today, the most expensive car ever sold anywhere in the world, and one of the most expensive objects of any kind ever sold at auction in any category, sitting alongside the very small handful of paintings that have ever cleared 9 figures. Mercedes has said the proceeds went toward establishing a global scholarship fund focused on environmental science and decarbonization for young people, which is either a beautifully fitting use for the money, or a slightly ironic one, depending on how you feel about a 180-mile-an-hour 1950s straight 8 funding the future of clean energy. The second Uhlenhaut Coupe remains on permanent, non-selling display at the Mercedes-Benz Museum. So if you ever find yourself in Stuttgart, you can walk right up to the sibling of the most expensive car on Earth, for the price of a museum ticket. Today's value, $143 million, and realistically, if the second example ever left Mercedes ownership, most industry experts believe it could top that figure entirely. So there you have it, from a $2 million French coach-built coupe all the way up to a car worth more than a private jet. What's wild is that every single car on this list was, at the time it was built, simply a really good sports car or race car. Nobody at Mercedes in 1955 thought they were building a $143 million object. They thought they were building the fastest, most advanced closed coupe in the world, full stop. That's really the through line here. These cars didn't become valuable because someone decided to make them scarce and expensive on purpose. They became valuable because they were engineered at the absolute edge of what was possible in their era, built in tiny numbers by people obsessed with getting every detail right, and then, in some cases, driven to genuine victories at the hardest races on Earth. 70 years later, the market has simply caught up to how special they actually were the whole time. If you enjoyed this one, let me know in the comments which car on this list you'd pick if money were genuinely no object, and stick around, because next time we're doing the same thing for the wildest, most expensive cars of the 1960s, and trust me, the numbers get even stranger. See you in the next one.